King Edward Park, Newcastle, one of the city's tourist attractions, and for most weekends of the year, a place for park and garden lovers in search of peace and tranquility on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. It's also considered one of the best hill climb courses in Australia and was the venue for round one of the 1972 Australian Hill Climb Championships. The tough, demanding course, which calls for precise handling and sharp reflexes from the drivers, starts down alongside Newcastle Beach before the start of the steep climb, and the first test for the drivers and the cars, Craven Filter Corner, an awkward right-hander. It leads into a narrow, steep little lane normally used only by pedestrian traffic. It's dubbed Purser's Pinch after a local driver who never quite made it past this point. It's also been the downfall of scores of other hill climbers over the years. Hard left at the top of the pinch and it's into the chicanes, a series of hay bales strategically placed along the straight before the right-hand curve which leads up to the hairpin bend, scene of many spectacular losers. Gloucester's Corner, a left-hander, and the last before the finish line at the top of the park. A total distance of 1,232 yards. Before this weekend, the outright record for the climb was 47.16 seconds. More than 60 cars, drivers and crews gathered for the titles, and some fairly strange cars were seen in the pits. Among the contenders for the outright win were several interstate drivers out to challenge the current record holder, Newcastle driver Murray Bingham. Stan Keane brought his Formula 5000 car from Adelaide for his tilt against Bingham, and other state champions including Victorian Jim Abbott. Further opposition was promised from another Victorian, Paul England, in his twin-engine four-wheel drive Oscar. And in the first runs, the southern competitors were watched with keen interest. But all eyes and ears were waiting for the first run of Bingham's Cobra after his shattering practice runs on the previous day. On this first run, he smashed the official record, bringing it down to 45.75, setting an almost impossible task for his challengers. Some of the most exciting duels of the day were seen in the competition for class wins, with Graham Crawford being the only driver to break 50 seconds in the racing under 2,000 cc's class. Bill Stoddart was one of those who tried to make up the leeway, but the best time he could manage was a 50.35, which put him third in his class behind David Tate. Although the open racing cars were to put up the fastest times of the day, the spectator interest was just as high for the sedans, the sports racing variety, like Ian Judd's Twanglia, taking a good line here through the pinch. Also the series touring cars, the improved touring sedans, and some of the sports cars. One of the crowd pleasers was the bright green Renault, driven in impeccable fashion by Ron Williams through the pinch and the chicanes. In the improved touring class, over 2,000 cc's, contested by several Tirana XU1s, record holder Brian Mayman set out to make sure nobody challenged him, setting a blistering pace on each of his runs. The pinch was to become the scene of several of the day's incidents, but Dave Boddy's XU1 manoeuvres it in a tidy fashion, something which Tony Cavo doesn't quite manage. The next victim was the Twanglia, which became entangled in the wall of sandbags and effectively put the Victorian driver out of the titles. Some breathtaking excitement was to develop during the day in what became known as the Battle of the Minis, with local drivers Peter Mullen and Jim Sullivan duelling with Victorian rallycross man Lindsay Siebler in the sports racing closed class. On this first run, Siebler set up an incredible 50.86, clipping more than 1.5 seconds off Peter Mullen's existing record, which the two Newcastle drivers then set out to catch. Graham Cromarty found his big GTHO quite a handful on the narrow hill climb course. Through the pinch, he came down on the side of discretion, but picked up speed through the chicanes. Still way out in front in his class, Brian Mayman was determined to stay there. Each of his runs had spectators holding their breath at some point. On this run, he almost lost it at the approaching hairpin. Obviously, not everybody was caught up in the excitement. But throughout the day, the pits area overlooking Newcastle Beach was the scene of almost as much activity as the course itself. And for the organisers, members of the MG Car Club of Newcastle, there was just as much work on the day looking after all the details that go into the successful running of a championship hill climb. But all the while, the action continued with the big racing cars chasing Murray Bingham's outright lead. Keane's Immaculate Elfin was quite a handful on the hill, particularly at the hairpin. The course took its toll of several cars, including Paul England's four-wheel drive Oscar. He had to weld up a crack in the chassis halfway through the day. Jim Abbott in the Brabham Traco V8 had a disappointing first run of just over 50 seconds, but on his second run he brought this down to 48.93. Tail out through the hairpin was a common sight throughout the day, even for the open wheelers. Stan Keane was showing up as Murray Bingham's main competition, and he was pushing the big Formula 5000 car just as hard as he could. With a leading margin of just over half a second, Murray Bingham was taking no chances of losing his lead. And he nearly paid the penalty of trying too hard at the hairpin. At the end of his second run, Bingham had brought the outright record down to an incredible 45.07 seconds. Stan Keane was now lagging 1.35 seconds behind, but was still a clear leader in his class. In the smaller racing car class, David Tate was chasing Graham Crawford's record time of 49.09, but the Cooper Ford finished almost a second behind. Barry Garner in his Bowen Holden goes very tidily through the chicanes and quickly into the right-hander. Kevin Rawlack, like many of the drivers, found the sun something of a problem on his later runs approaching the pinch. Shane Sullivan in his MGB made his way neatly through the hay bales, while on the other hand, Ray Foster was a little spectacular. Peter Irwin was assured of a class win for a Curie Triumph, being the only entrant. But it was a different story in the continuing battle of the minis, with Peter Mullen and Jim Sullivan still trying to catch Lindsay Siebler for class honours. Another mini driver, but in a different class, was Wilf Slater, going very cleanly through the chicanes. But tidiness was the last thing in the minds of other mini drivers. First, there was Joseph Ruin.
To avoid the rock wall by a brilliant bit of driving to hang on to the car. He sorts it out and he's still running well. That was amazing.
Lindsay Siebler.
Now he hangs on really. He's right driving. He's down into the car. The car's come to bits, but no damage at all. He went off the road, down the grass, right down into the sunken garden. First time that we've seen the sunken garden wearing a purple mini for decoration. But there was no doubt about that. He was just trying much too fast. Got all switched up before he hit Cravenfield corner, got around it sideways and just managed to hang on onto it, overcorrected and went off on the inside down into the sunken garden. And there he is, well and truly, 25 yards off the seal surface.
And that was Peter Mullen, which left the class win to Jim Sullivan.
Too hard.
The action continued with Graham Cromarty. Sydney driver Stan Adler provided his usual rock and roll thrills. Alan East in his Tirana XU1 maintained his clear lead in his series touring class throughout the day, setting a new record of 53.90. The improved XU1s of Jim Jenkins and Dave Boddy, while providing some spectacular driving during the titles, were no match for the flying Tirana of Brian Mayman.
Yes, we've got Dave Boddy, he's got the tail out well.
Mayman clinched his class win and a new record with a run of 51.19 seconds, breaking his own record by nearly 4 seconds. For Jim Abbott, Paul England and Stan Keane, there was only one run left to catch the flying Murray Bingham, but the gap proved too much. So the first round of the Australian hill climb title went to a very happy Murray Bingham. He later went on to clinch the 1972 series.
World Championships in
the 19